Welcome to Hodlermania Podcast, your photography and video podcast, where we introduce you to some of the most amazing creatives from around the world. I'm your host, Wayne Johns, and I'm here with my good friend, buddy, and co-host, Jake Hicks. Hey, buddy.
How you doing, Wayne? We are face-to-face today.
Face-to-face.
I don't know what I've done wrong to deserve this, but...
And almost touching distance,
I know,
worryingly.
in the same room.
The same room.
You've got a little bit of bronzer on there today, mate. I don't know, have you been outside or not working hard?
It's called a bit of a sweat on, mate, I think, in all fairness.
Studio shooters don't tend to have a bronzed look. Dirty casual?
Natural colour, mate. Natural. Just my aura is coming through, or something of that terminology. Well, we're in a really beautiful location today as well, aren't we? I'm not saying the weather's brilliant because it's a bit shit outside, to be fair, isn't it? But we're in a very interesting place, aren't we?
We are, I know, yeah.
Do you want to give any sort of little leads?
No, it's a top secret location.
Top secret location.
Yeah.
Something to do with the cinematic world.
A lot to do with it.
Yeah, just a little bit. Yeah. You were surrounded by lots of lovely gear and tech and lots of pictures of lots of movie stars and...
Yeah, I hope I'm going to be escorted out because I'll never find my way back out otherwise. It's like amazing.
I think you will if you keep lifting those.
Oh yeah, the lenses. Yeah.
Should we let people know where we are?
Absolutely.
A bit of an intro.
Let's do it.
And welcome to episode 10. Well, it's nice not to do the 00 digits again, mate.
You made it.
Welcome to 00.
Who thought we'd make it?
Yeah, we're still going, and still enjoying it as well, mate. That's the main thing. So in this episode, we talked to a man who used to engineer pieces of military hardware for the Royal Navy. But being a keen photographer and a somewhat passion expert, if we want to call it that, he entered the world of video and is now the MD of Panavision Europe. Welcome to our show, Jeff Allen. Jeff,
nice
welcome.
To be here. Thank you.
Thank you.
And just to clarify for your audience, I'm actually responsible for EMEA, which is Europe and Africa. We do have operations in both Cape Town and Johannesburg, and they in turn have a sub-agent in Kenya, in Nairobi.
Superb. Nice.
That's a fairly decent region, Jeff, to be MD of.
Years, yeah.
That's bigger than what I originally said.
Keeps me busy.
Yeah, I certainly do appreciate your time this afternoon, Jeff. I mean, you must be incredibly busy. Yeah, so thank you for that.
Yeah, and thank you for having us here at Panavision as well. I mean, it's an awesome place to be.
Incredible, yeah. So much history here as well. Yeah. How long has Panavision been going?
Panavision's been going since 1953.
Okay.
It was Gottschalk and Moore were the two founding members of the company.
I saw that picture of them down.
And they started making projection lenses originally.
Okay.
That's how they sort of got themselves into the movie business.
Seems to be two people starting a company that goes global, doesn't it? Jake, let's hope, mate.
So yeah, they started in Los Angeles back in 1953. And I'm sure they didn't know at that time that it would end up being a global company.
Yeah, it's huge. Yeah.
So we're all around the world and associated in many studios around the world as well. So Panavision's, I guess, along with one of our main competitors, an iconic name in the industry.
For sure. Yeah. Do you have any idea what sort of percentage of movies will go through Panavision at some point, whether it be lenses or cameras or?
I mean, it does fluctuate from year to year.
Sure.
But I mean, we have a healthy, let's put it this way, we have a healthy percentage of the market. We're not crying, let's put it that way.
For sure, yeah.
So for our audience, Jeff, just to get some clarification, we asked this question, it's the first question to all of our guests on the podcast. How would you describe yourself and what you do? And also, because our audience is perhaps some are amateurs, some are pros, and the mix in between, and maybe some are from the stills world and not a film world. Also, just give a little brief of what Panavision are and what they do.
Sure. So let's start off with what Panavision is and what it does, basically. So Panavision is one of the leading companies in the world for providing cinematography cameras and lenses. That's kind of where our roots come from. We also supply lighting in certain territories in the world. We also have studios in which you can shoot in, primarily in commercials, mainly in the UK and South Africa. And we have, in the last few years, got into post-production as well with an offshoot, which is called Light Iron. In terms of the stills market, we service professionals through a business called Direct Digital, which is based in London, Manchester, and Paris, with a sub office down in Cape Town. So pretty much every facet of the kind of, if you like, the picture creating circle, whether that's stills or moving image, we're involved in the industry in some way, basically.
And you're talking about the top end as well. When you say cinematography, we're talking about Star Wars level cinema.
I mean, we're also talking about, I know Doritos commercials and things like that. So, we're kind of covering the whole genre. I mean, in television, we predominantly deal with television drama. Mm-hmm. So anything from shows like The Crown to, Waking the Dead or whatever, these kind of shows. Things like The Fabulous Mrs. Maisel in New York. They're the kind of shows that the company does globally. So, yes, we're kind of mainly established in that part of the television marketplace. In terms of high-end feature films, yes, we've been lucky enough to work with some fantastic directors of photography and with some fantastic directors. We've been heavily involved in many of the Harry Potter films, in many of the James Bond films, many of the action thrillers that people like Tom Cruise have starred in. So we've been in a fortunate place in being able to service the major film studios across the globe.
As a huge coverage, yeah. I mean, and I suppose if it's been going for...
And for that many years as well, yeah.
60, 70 years.
Then, obviously, with what Panavision do as a company and how they supply product and design product and tailor product, we'll get to this conversation as well a bit later on. And
well, I here's a kind of something that to kind of give a smile, if you like, to the listener. Back in the early days when Panavision created its first film camera that was solely of its own design, it's a camera called the Panaflex back in the early 70s. And of course, being a Californian-based company, there was a little black bar on the back of the camera. And that was there so that the cameraman or the operator could hang their sunglasses on the back of the camera while they were looking through the viewfinder.
Now we're talking. That's So we don't have many sunglass holders in the UK.
We don't.
Yeah, we have coat hooks for rain
covers.
Exactly. Isn't it? But the point I'm making is that it's that kind of attention to detail that there was always we always look for. We're always trying to get feedback from our clients and, trying to understand ways in which we can make their life easier, make things quicker, make them more repeatable. Obviously, to increase the reliability of that equipment, it's put through some pretty harsh conditions.
Oh, yeah.
When you think that we could be in the, tundra wastes of Finland in the middle of winter at -40 or in the Mojave Desert, at +40, you've got to have equipment that can stand those two extremes, basically. And that's a pretty tough act. And I think, and the film industry in general manages to cope with that quite well. I mean, of course, we all have our moments, we all have our stories we can tell. But by and large, the equipment's fairly reliable and robust, and it's designed to be so.
Yeah, I mean, when we came in reception, there's obviously a line of cameras from years gone by, and some of them are built like absolute tanks. Yeah.
They certainly are, yeah. I mean, obviously, we've come a long way to the studio cameras that were designed and built in the sort of 1940s and 1950s. Everything's much more smaller and lighter, in much the same way as we're seeing that trend in the stills market, where everybody's gradually moved away from film into digital. Then DSLRs are being gradually replaced by mirrorless cameras. So the and the motion picture industry is a good recipient of some of the technological advances in the stills market. They kind of rub off into our industry. So we've been pretty thankful for the stills industry because it's allowed us to cherry pick some of the best innovations and bring them to the cinematography.
I think they feed each other as well.
They feed each other.
Certainly comes back around for sure. Yeah, it's as well as trends and that sort of thing. Yeah.
So that's a little insight of Panavision, which we'll get into more. So what's your role, Jeff, within Panavision?
So I guess the way we once described it to our staff is, if you think of an orchestra and the conductor, I guess the managing director of any company is a bit like the conductor. He has to make sure that the string section's working well and the brass section's working well and the percussion section's working well, so that the whole company can function properly. And it's my job to make sure that we're delivering a consistent service to our clients, that we are there to meet any challenges, and if there are challenges, that we resolve them quickly, and that we look after the welfare of our staff and our clients, and that we run the business in a manner that means that the shareholders get a return on their investment, because that's what they're putting the money into the business for. And that's how capitalism, which is what we're all part of, works.
Yeah.
How long have you been here, Jeff?
That's a good question. I've been in the industry 35 years.
Okay. How did you make the leap from the Royal Navy to...
Well, I wasn't actually in the Royal Navy. I worked for an engineering company.
Because you come from an engineering background initially, don't you?
My background was in precision engineering.
Okay.
In fact, a couple of my colleagues here worked for the same company way back in the day. That company, which was Ernest F. Moy, also used to make some film equipment, which is where the connection comes initially from, basically. So there was the product called the Moy geared head, which we used to put the camera on to be able to move the camera around so it could pan or tilt and follow the actor or the actress. So we used to make those as one of the products the company made. But by and large, most of its money at the time I worked for it was made from military contracts.
Okay.
We used to do things like kind of tachometers that used to track the trajectory of missiles, and we made jigs for other manufacturers that used to make torpedoes and all weird and wonderful things that for the Ministry of Defence, basically.
Okay. And that just seemed the natural next step was...
well, I mean, like anyone, once you start in an organisation,
it's true. Yeah.
You want to move on at some point. And I did go to a couple of other engineering companies, and then ended up at a company called Lee Lighting, which was my kind of entry into the film industry.
Is that now Lee Filters?
No. Lee Lighting and a company was subsumed with another company called AFM, which we bought to become Panelux, which is our lighting business, basically. So that's how that happened. So Lee Lighting was started by two brothers, John and Benny Lee, who were, I guess it's fair to say, treated as lovable rogues.
Right.
But they were good innovators.
They call them hustlers now.
Yeah. They were certainly were the life and soul of the party. But equally, they put a lot back into the industry, and they were a fantastic breeding ground for many people that have gone on to be very famous cinematographers or gaffers.
What era are you talking about here now then?
So I'm talking about the 70s into the 80s, into the kind of early 90s. They used to have a studio as well. In fact, at one point, they actually owned Shepperton Studios, which was then sold on and is now part of the Pinewood Shepperton Group. They were a great training ground for all of us. And from that came a company called Joe Dunton Cameras, started by Joe Dunton. I ended up joining that company and that company then morphed into Panavision UK. And from Panavision UK, we've grown the business to be a business that covers, through acquisition and organic growth, into a company that covers Europe and Africa.
Wow.
So as the conductor of this orchestra, do you miss playing in the trenches, as it were? Do you miss the engineering side?
I guess there are times when I do miss the engineering side. I mean, I try to keep abreast of what we're doing there. We do have at Panavision, we have something called the Innovation Steering Committee. Okay. So we kind of look at things we should be doing and ideas, some of which get to market, some of which don't.
And to be fair, yeah, because you are very hands-on. I know we spoke last year about some things that we're working on and that sort of thing, and so you're definitely very hands-on with some of the new ideas.
Yeah, and obviously, Jake, you and I met through the association with Lee Filters.
Correct. Yeah. Which is part of Panavision.
Which is part of Panavision. Yeah, that was started. That business was started by the Lee brothers originally. That's why it still retains the Lee name. Of course, for people in the photographic market, it's a well-known name for obviously lighting filter and for camera filters. But also it's a known brand for camera filters and lighting filters in the cinematography market as well. It's not just stills.
Huge, yeah.
And so, most Hollywood productions, some way or another, will be using Lee Filters brand of lighting control filters, or one of its main competitors, one of which is Roscoe.
I've vaguely heard of it.
Yeah. So I've taken a keen interest in some of the innovation that they're looking at, and sometimes, as you and I have discussed, sometimes you go back and you look in the toolbox of the past and say, let's reinvent the uninvented again and see whether it's fit for a new world.
Agreed,
Many innovations that were created for a film world, most of which in the stills market anyway has disappeared. It's interesting to see how those filters react and work in a digital age. We've gone down this path basically in cinematography as well, where we've had more and more resolution, more and more sharp, high contrast pictures. And that's great in certain scenarios. Sure, and I think it's good that we all push ourselves to meet ever increasing technical expectations. But it doesn't suit every genre, basically. And sometimes you need to, what I would call, break the picture a bit. You need to, soften it up or give it a different look of some sort.
This is where we look back at some of these lenses and products from years gone. Yeah.
Exactly, and we kind of have to think about how does that fit in with the stylization of the cinematographer, the photographer, director, whoever is trying to formulate a look for a production, whether that's stills or cinematography.
For example, like a period piece.
Exactly.
It doesn't need to be razor sharp 8K. It doesn't need that look.
Exactly. If you're trying to do, for instance, a poster for Hovis, and you're harking back to the 1930s, and it's a big hoarding as you go down the A4. You don't want it to look like it's crystal clear, sharp as anything, because it doesn't invoke a feeling of nostalgia that you're trying to create. So
for our international listeners, Hovis is bread.
It's a bread. Yeah, sorry. Yes, I should have said that.
From days gone.
Exactly. So you may want to give that a look which is not crystal clear or sharp.
Yeah.
On the other hand, of course, if you're trying to pull mattes or some kind of CGI work for a big blockbuster movie, you may need all the resolution in the world.
Yeah.
And therefore, the best image size you can get from the biggest sensor with the best lenses may be what you need.
And that gives them the ability to change stuff later
exactly,
if they need to. Yeah.
So So it's the right tool for the right job, basically. I think that any craftsman will want a selection of tools to use, and that's true whether you're a carpenter, a tool maker, as I was, or a cinematographer or a photographer. You want to be able to have a selection of tools that help you create a look.
Panavision was involved with The Crown recently, is that right? This show,
We were involved in The Crown. We still are. That's obviously a large Netflix show.
Yeah. Did they use equipment that maybe gave them a slightly softer look? Or
actually, no, they didn't.
Okay.
They actually used a fairly modern camera.
Okay.
And fairly modern lenses for that.
Okay.
And most of what you see there is down to the way in which Adriana Goldman, the DOP,
okay.
Has lit the show and provided that kind of look. I mean, of course, the camera choice and the lenses play into that.
Yeah.
Of course, yeah.
But his lighting style and what he was looking for, and the directors of the show are where their collaboration comes in, basically.
And I know some of the older shows, I can't remember one off the top of my head now, the name escapes me, but I know some of the older shows did use, or not, newer shows of period pieces shoot everything on high quality film with, brand new lenses, but then they'll use something like a low contrast filter over the actual lens itself. So they're using everything, but still just softening it, in between in camera and post sort of thing.
I mean, it's again, there are certain, there are always situations where you want to be forgiving to your subject. So, if you've got an aging actress, for instance, that
I don't know why he's looking at Wayne. I don't know why.
Look at me. That's it.
You're trying to, give a more dreamy look to or something. Then you may want to use some kind of low contrast filter to be able to slightly soften that look. Maybe just on the principal shots, particularly on close-up shots where you've of that particular actress.
Panavision's come a long way from the tights over the lens, and
well, I mean,
breathe in on those filters.
Whether you're netting the back of the lens, which still goes on.
It is the back of the lens as well, isn't it?
Or whether you're putting a black dot filter in front of the lens, or
a black dot filter.
Black dot filters we have.
What is that?
It's basically like a filter where you've got a splattering of black dots on the front just to diffuse the light, or you can have it.
So it's pretty obvious then.
Or you can have it with white dots as well.
Okay,
similar sort of thing. Or you could be using a Pro Mist or one of these types of filters to soften the image.
Yeah.
And again, I think as Jake, as you and I have spoken about, there's sometimes a misconception about some of the low contrast filters that they soften the whole image, which is actually not true.
Agreed, yeah.
You can still keep perfectly sharp features like eyes, for instance. What it's really doing is blowing the highlights predominantly in the shots.
Yeah, I think we spoke about it before. It's basically reducing the contrast. And I think we're used to, in the modern world with Photoshop and that sort of thing, we are used to seeing sharpened images as essentially more contrast, because all Photoshop is doing when it sharpens an image is increase the contrast of adjacent pixels. So if we do the reverse and reduce the contrast, it appears softer, but it's still perfectly pin sharp and in focus. I love using some of those. I know Lee does the Lee Softs, which is probably not the best wording for a product, and they also do the low contrast filters as well, and they are phenomenal. But the images are absolutely razor sharp. So you're right, there is a bit of a misconception with using lens filters. Yeah.
And the other thing to say about that is that, of course, if you modify a lens, then the only way you can change that look is literally take that lens and unmodify it. With a filter, you can take it away, put it back in again.
True.
So you're not really changing the characteristic of the lens. So you can choose when to use the filter.
Safer.
If you've selected a lens for a look, which is perfectly plausible, perfectly reasonable thing to do, it's there for the production. Basically, it's throughout. Every shot will get that look. Whereas with a filter, you could select it for certain shots.
Do you have?
You could with a lens if you take more than one lens type, of course.
Sure.
Fair to say.
Yeah.
But by and large, cinematographers, if they pick a set of lenses, will pick that set of lenses and take that set of lenses out, and they'll stick with that look, basically.
Yeah, because it gives them that specific look.
Exactly.
When you say that's what, Panavision is sort of famous for some of those lenses. I mean, you have DOPs and directors that come specifically to Panavision for those specific lenses.
Yes. I mean, I think it's fair to say that we have some technicians that work for us, particularly in our head office in Los Angeles, that are experts at adapting lenses to give a specific look, and they'll work with cinematographers to make those changes that they're looking for.
Can you give an example of some of those changes? What would a director or DOP be changing?
Some of those lenses are literally where we may be changing the spacing of certain elements in the lens. So you're defocusing slightly the lens in a certain plane.
Yeah.
There are other methods, some of which I'm not prepared to go into.
We'll get into the secret sauce.
Cups of tea and dunking.
That we'll use to change the characteristics of the lens.
Okay.
One of the things that, one of the ways in which, of course, this has been done for many years is taking a lens, and I've got a couple of examples I can show you. Of course, the audience can't see this. So in Panavision's case, we have SP series of lenses. It's a very early set of lenses that we had, and we have two versions of those.
How old are these lenses on the table in front of you?
I think I could be standard corrected on this, but I think they stem back to sort of like the 60s and 70s.
Wow.
And do people still use them?
People still use them a lot. Yes, they do.
Yeah.
And we have a coated version and an uncoated version of the same lens. And the coated version, the lens characteristics, because they're an older lens, tend to be slightly softer than we would expect to see in a more high contrast modern lens like a Primo, for instance, or the Primo 70s that we have. And then the other version is an uncoated lens. So there's no multi-coating on the lens element at all. And what that will tend to do is, particularly if you've got light shining onto the front of it, it will flare the image.
So this is pre all the coatings that we now have on all of our lenses as standard.
Yeah.
So
this is pre
and one of the things to say about coatings is that coatings themselves have dramatically altered the way in which lenses control aberrations. It's not just the optical formulas that do that. Many times, you'll see these schematics when, let's say, Nikon or Canon or Fujinon, one of those manufacturers, launches a lens. You'll see these schematics of the lens groups and what T-stop it is and where the iris is. But very rarely will they go into talking about what they've done with the coatings. Yes, it will say it's got super spectra coating or multi-coating or something.
But it's vague.
But they don't really go into the specifics of those coatings. And what's tended to happen is that those layers have become many more than they were in the past.
Yeah.
And each layer may do a different job to the one before, basically. So part of the way in which chromatic aberrations or lateral aberrations are being controlled and mitigated is by the use of those coatings.
Okay. Because Panavision doesn't sell lenses; it only rents lenses.
We only rent lenses. Yeah. We design. Panavision buys equipment from third parties as well.
Sure.
But we're known. We're known for our cameras, but we're known mainly for our lenses.
Yeah.
So one of the areas in which I think it's fair to say Panavision has the biggest selection of lenses in the industry is in anamorphic lenses.
Okay.
Yes.
And going all the way back to the C series and the D series lenses, right the way up to the modern T series lenses that we have. We have, brought to market different types of anamorphic lens that do slightly different jobs, create slightly different looks, or different sizes and weights.
Of course, there are some benefits to only renting as well, because there are certain coatings on some of these older lenses that are sought after that perhaps you can't
non-existent
get anymore.
Yeah. There are some of the old coating processes definitely are not there anymore. The other thing to say about lenses, which you can't get anymore, and that's something I think is quite important for people to try and understand, is that all of the early lenses would have been made out of leaded glass.
Okay.
And you cannot make lenses out of a leaded glass any longer.
It's frowned upon.
It's frowned upon, basically. I mean, that's
lead
why
content is just having interruptions of that ingredient.
You can't really buy lead crystal glass anymore, because if you left your Scotch or brandy in in a decanter, over time the lead actually leaches out into the
lead poisoning. Here we come.
Into the Scotch or whatever's in there, and it's actually exactly right. You get lead poisoning. So unless you can control the full life cycle of a lens from original manufacture right the way through to disposal, you can't actually sell lenses any longer which have lead in them.
Right. And some people come to you for that look because it does give a beautiful
rainbow. So we still have some old lenses which obviously were using leaded glass, which we cannot get anymore. Now you may ask, why is that important? Well, you used to get a certain clarity or an aim value from leaded glass, which you can't quite match or replicate with modern glasses. Basically.
So would you say it was an improvement back then? Are you saying? Or?
It was just a look. Leaded glass always used to give a very good clarity, basically. Which is, I'm not saying modern glass can't give you that clarity, but it was easier to achieve with leaded glass than it may be to achieve today with the processes we use now. That's why things like fluoride have come about in terms of types of lens type, and some of the, as I said, going back to the coatings, some of the coatings are one of the ways to try and mitigate some of the issues of using glass which is not lead.
Okay. And you've got some other lenses here. I mean, some of these are so old that obviously not made anymore. You said some of them were relatively expensive as well.
They are relatively expensive, yes. But let's go back to one of the older lenses first. This one I've got with me now is been converted by a company called Century, which was an American company. I don't believe they're in existence actually anymore.
One of your favourite lenses is, Jake, isn't it? I think it's just based on value.
But inside it is a Cook Series 2.
And how old is this, sorry?
Well, the Cook Series 2s, I believe, were made back in the 60s. And they morphed into the Series 3s. But in cinematography circles, you'll hear a term used, the Cook look.
Okay.
And the Cook look was basically a lens that had a warmer look to it than most of the, let's say, for instance, his biggest competitors at that time was Zeiss. And Zeiss were very Germanic, and that they were high contrast lenses, technically probably very proficient for their day. Of course, again, those designs have got better as we've gone along.
Perfection is not always better.
But exactly, perfection may not all be better. So Cooks got a name for themselves as one of the lenses of choice for period dramas and things like that.
Because of that slightly
warmer look. Exactly.
And that's what I think is missing, especially from the photographic industry, where people are always wanting the best and the biggest and the fastest and the cleanest and the sharpest, is that in the film world and the cinema world, lenses give a desired look or a desired feel or a desired warmth or desired focus technique, and DOPs have those lenses for those desired looks rather than doing it all in post. They're getting all these lenses out to create that look based on the elements of these lenses and the way they give it to the industry. It's something we don't have in the photographic world for sure.
Also to the same extent, yes.
We have a screw-on filter. And that's
but really, most of us are still using older lenses to replicate that look anyway, whether it be the Zeniths or the Helios and sort of stuff.
And one of the most successful cameras in the last 9-10 years has been the Arri Alexa. And that camera, of course, regardless of what reiteration of it there is, has basically the same sensor. There's variations of it, but it's essentially the same basic design. So you can imagine all the hundreds of thousands of productions that have shot with that camera, whether you're talking about a 10-second television commercial or a 2-hour feature film. If they were all to be shot with the same camera, with the same lenses, and processed the same way, they'd all look exactly the same.
Yeah, indeed.
And that's not what people want. So your sensor is effectively your emulsion. So the only way you can change your emulsion, unlike in the film days where you could change your emulsion,
Yes.
is to basically do that partly with lens choice. Of course, you can do so much in post, in digital, that you can change the look with your LUTs or whatever, and that's all part of that process. But lens choice is part of that concatenation, if you like, of different elements that can give you that look that you're after.
On top of that,
John Newsham said exactly the same thing the last podcast. He said, there's just a black box behind it. Really, is the lens is really the thing that's giving you that look and feel, and that's definitely the driving.
A previous episode was with a DP and cinematographer based in Hell's Kitchen in New York City. So, he's saying exactly the same as you. And on the film side, pretty much
just
word for word.
Really, the lens is really where the heart of it is.
Yeah, he doesn't care about the tech per se on the back, but the lens choice is what gives him the desired look. And, some DOPs have their favourite go-tos, depending obviously what they're filming, like period drama, they're going to go for that certain look to get that certain feel.
And of course, one of the things I guess we should talk about, because it's been one of the kind of buzzwords and one of the methods to creating a different look in stills has been HDR, and that's of course something that particularly what we would call the OTT companies like Netflix or Amazon have looked at as a way of differentiating their programs. Particularly with some of the higher end digital TVs we now have.
Yes,
it's been high dynamic range, and so that's another way of creating a slightly different look, because as we know, HDR tends to also give you slightly punchier, more saturated colours. It's which again work for certain looks depending on what you're after. It doesn't work in every case, of course.
And that HDR that you're talking about in terms of giving you more contrast with regards to saturation is kind of counterintuitive, because HDR is essentially almost, people have the idea of flattening out an image in terms of exposure. But what that is doing is giving you just an incredible amount of data that enables you to push the contrast and saturation to extreme limits without getting any image breakup, which I think is, some people get confused with what HDR what that means. When you actually have an image that's flat, that's the most data that you possibly have that can then be cranked to the extreme ends.
You've got the tolerances to play with that and expand it. And then you take all that technology, and like I've recently built a new television in my house, and I bought an LG which has got this true color technology in it, which is true life color. All my skin tones and everything look completely natural now. So all those punched HDR colours you normally see on older screens now look so realistic and flat.
Okay.
it's gone the other way.
If I want real, I can go outside, mate.
I look at my TV and I'm like, am I looking out of a window? Because that skin tone looks too real from how you would expect it to be on previous televisions, how they used to display that kind of imagery. So it's counterintuitive on the viewer's end. Yeah.
It's interesting as well when you talk of televisions, because we have this debate. Obviously, one of the jobs that Panavision and our competition have in this industry is to technically work with the cinematographer and his crew to deliver the most technical, competent picture we can. Of course, particularly if you're talking about high-end television, we have no control over the way that user sees the picture in their home.
That was the thing recently with Game of Thrones. They were kicking that. People going, it's too dark. They're watching it on their iPad in daylight. And it's like, well, what do you expect? People were going around and brightening up the episodes of Game of Thrones. It's like, you're totally missing the point. You wouldn't go and brighten up Picasso's work. What are you doing?
But I remember a conversation with one of the technical guys at the BBC a number of years ago. And he said the biggest problem that they have is that most people take the television out of the box, they put it in their living room, and just watch it straight out of the box.
Yeah,
and what happens is that television manufacturers deliver their televisions with this much punchier look that they do for if you're putting it in John Lewis to try and sell it to you, basically.
It's the same with LCDs on the back of digital cameras. They look amazing. Like every image you take, it's like, wow, oh my God, I'm amazing at this.
Because
then you get the raw, and it's
exactly, because you're seeing a JPEG image on the back of your camera. You're not seeing the raw image.
Yeah.
And that's always going to be an issue. But it's also another reason on set why it's so important for the cinematographer to set his LUT for the show, so they know what the look they're trying to get.
So that's locked in before the cameras are set up and the tripods are erected. That's
normally one of the early things that's locked in is the look, basically.
I really wasn't sure about that. I didn't know whether it was a case of like, let's get the footage back and let's see how we want to go. But that's all locked in, dialed in. LUTs are on set.
I mean, I wouldn't want to say that's done for every show, but it's done for most of them. Okay, basically. So yes, because you need to have an element of control. It's a bit like us as stills photographers. Certainly at your level, you're probably using a data spider or something to calibrate your monitor.
I mean, you'd be surprised, but yeah, I understand what you're getting at. Yeah, I don't have my iPhone on evening mode,
but for certainly for a lot of people, if they're going to be printing their photographs,
completely
you want to calibrate your monitor so that what you're seeing on your monitor is what you're going to be getting off your printer. And that is, I actually think that's an area of photography where there's, for some people, things like IPCC profiles is a black art, and there's much, it's a dying art, exactly. I think that there is much more that could be done there to encourage people to get back to printing their photographs, not just seeing them on a screen. But because the process seems overly complicated and too complex for a lot of people, they're not interested.
Yeah, I dusted my photo printer off the other day, actually.
You still got one? Do you still have one?
Yeah.
Right.
I got the older 9500 Mark II, A2 Plus.
Right.
Still have that. Dusted that bad boy off, ready for its next print.
Is it in that 90s beige colour that
no, it's still modern.
Digital products used to be
just got to rehydrate the 10 ink tanks. Still working.
But recently I've taken to printing some of my photographs A3 rather than just looking at them on a monitor.
Yeah. And
it's actually when you actually are not looking at a monitor and you're looking at a print.
Pleasing.
It's also you see things that I don't understand why, but I guess because you're kind of spending more time looking at a photograph, you start to see details that you think, actually, I don't like that. I want to tweak that again.
You can't do anything but see the whole picture as well, which you never do on a screen.
And it starts to bring back a little bit more discipline into what you feel is an acceptable photograph, basically, in my mind anyway. I could be wrong. Maybe I'm a dinosaur and hey, everything should just live on a LCD screen.
No.
But actually, I think that if you go to a gallery or you go to a photographic fair or you go to something like Photokina and you look at some shots printed, or the photography show, you look at some shots printed. It's amazing when you just stand back and watch people look at them, how much dwell time they'll spend on a photograph.
That's true.
I wonder whether they spend the same amount of time looking at that same image on an LCD screen.
There's no way. Yeah, there's no way they do. You're absolutely right.
So I think that it's part of the pleasure of photography is being lost a little bit by not considering printing anymore. I think it's a side of photography that needs to be talked about more than actually it is really.
Yeah, that's the reason why we photograph things, isn't it? Which I know has been another topic somewhere else, is to see the damn things in print. I mean, there's no point in shooting 1,000 images and you're being stuck on a hard drive when nobody can look at them and appreciate all that beauty and all that glory. But I mean, and especially for our listeners, which we're touching on, we've naturally just merged into the fact you're still very heavily into photography, aren't you? You're very photographically influenced.
I mean, my father, when I can't actually remember exactly how young I was. It was either 14 or 16. I think it was probably more 14. My father gave me a twin lens Yashica mat, basically.
I know it well. I used to have one. Yeah.
And that was my entry into film. So 120.
It's a cheap Rolleiflex.
Yeah.
Cheap Rolly version.
Exactly. So that was my sort of entree into photography. and that kind of spurred me on to want to get into it more. So I remember, I can't remember the name of the camera store now, but it was one down in Euston that had a chain of shops. And I remember going down there, and I didn't really know much about DSLRs. Walked into the store, and the first camera I saw was a Canon.
Yeah.
It was a Canon FT, and that was the camera I bought. Basically, that was my kind of entree into becoming a lifelong Canon user.
Still have one?
I don't have the FT, unfortunately. No, I still have one DSLR, SLR, which is the first EOS camera, the 650.
Okay, I've still got a couple of AE1s and
I wish I still got mine. Every day I kick myself for selling my AE1 and my AE1 program.
I still got.
I wish I'd not sold them, but unfortunately I did.
You know, the one I've got is still in the box. Still comes, still box, still with a printed instruction manual and a printed manual of how to take photos with the sundial and all the old ASA, but it's still with the original camera in the box. Yeah.
So just a reminder for your listeners. So the EOS system was brought out in 1987 by Canon, and I guess we don't realize just how revolutionary or different that was back then. It was quite revolutionary at the time, as indeed the AE1 was when that came out, because that was the first computer-controlled camera.
Yeah, well, Canon have had a lot of milestones. They've been quiet in recent years, bless them. But they have.
Right way of saying it.
I guess we've all had this debate about how Canon kind of, and Nikon to some degree, have kind of missed the boat a little bit with mirrorless and are now playing catch up to the likes of Fuji and Sony in particular, who've really done that very well.
Yes.
Although I have to say, in defence, there's me saying I'm a lifelong Canon user. Back in the day, I did actually buy Olympus's first 4/3 camera.
Okay.
And then went on to buy one of their micro 4/3 cameras, purely and simply because they were so small. You could shove them in a pocket and carry them around. So they were really, I guess, if you like, Panasonic and Olympus were actually the first people into that marketplace. Of course, on a much smaller sensor size than Fuji and Sony entered it.
But speaking of Canon and cinematography and what you guys, Canon brought out the 5D Mark II. I don't know the year, but obviously what they did in terms of bringing video to still shooters was phenomenal at the time. I don't know how many 5D Mark IIs they shifted, but they must have broke the records with that.
They certainly
were
did.
so far ahead with that.
Yeah, I remember being at Photokina when they did their press conference.
So, do you have any idea about the year roughly?
I can't remember. I should remember, but unfortunately, I can't remember.
I don't know when the 5D Mark II came out.
Yeah, I can't remember. I remember being there, and I think we kind of regaled this story a little bit earlier, but at their press event, they were really aiming that camera at wedding photographers and law enforcement agencies and government agencies, both of which had said, look, often we have to take a stills camera and a video camera. Wouldn't it be great if you could combine the two?
So wedding shooters, obviously, they're shooting some video and they're shooting some stills, and you're saying that, public sector like military and police were doing the same thing, surveillance-wise. They're shooting,
and Canon really didn't consider at that time that there would be this, I guess, this kind of vlogger market that we now see today. Of course, the speeds were limited on the camera when it first came out. I believe actually. Not long after that camera came out, the 7D came out, and that had a greater range of camera speeds for video use, which Canon had to quickly put onto the 5D Mark II to give it parallel abilities. But they just did not see the market in terms of where it was going to go. Of course, they benefited from it, and they created a market which has, stayed the course now.
It was massive. I was a massive 5D2 user.
You used
I came
it
in
for
on
years,
5D
used it
Mark
for years in
I.
the studio. Yeah, I must shot tens of thousands
You're
of
the
shots on
same,
that thing in the studio. Yeah, we had a couple. But I think you're on when you mentioned this story to me earlier on. I think you're on the money when you said that they were being encouraged by public sector, whether it be military and. Because obviously you have no insider information on this, but I think you're on the money with that. I think they made that for that huge contract in mind to get that major gig of military and police, and then it just took off in the actual photographic world. But it's funny to hear that you were there at Photokina when they were announcing it, and it was just so directed in this one area,
Yeah,
and it just went
particularly wedding photographers.
Exactly, it just went completely. It was just crazy.
And it was. I don't think for a minute Canon thought that the Hollywood users would be using this camera, which they did basically. So
has Panavision seen any benefit or lack of benefit to having something like that out there? Like
no, I mean what I would say though, in Sony's defense, is that Canon had that market in terms of an insert camera with the 5D Mark II.
Agreed. Yeah.
They didn't keep up in terms of video, and effectively have lost that market now in terms of cinematography anyway, where we use those kind of cameras to Sony.
True.
Yeah.
So the A7S and the A7S Mark II, etc., that they've all kind of cleaned up in that space in our industry anyway. If you want kind of little insert shots with something small like that, that's the camera that people use.
Yeah, because it's been there. It's been there.
They're not using a 5D Mark IV, for instance.
No,
for that. So,
but that's the thing with it as well. Is it? I mean, they are so small and compact now that they're so small to take on set. Yeah. And so easy, and the quality and resolution out of them is phenomenal.
So if they're so good, does Panavision suffer in any way from this?
No, I mean you've still got to
different tool.
You've got to go back to part of our earlier conversation. You're expecting a product to withstand quite a lot of abuse, basically.
Yeah.
Movie cameras get subject to some pretty harsh conditions.
I see some love rubs on some of the cameras out there. Yeah.
That's love rubs.
Even though Canon, Nikon, Sony will tell you how this is weather sealed.
Right. Okay. Yeah. But can you throw it at a wall and still pick it up and use it? No.
They should really go out on an action movie and see how cameras get treated to realise that it's in a different league.
Of course it is.
That's true.
And plus the fact, that, you could be shooting at, standard speed, 24, 25 frames a second.
Yeah.
But equally, you could be shooting at 120 frames a second.
Yeah.
Or 96 frames a second or something.
Yeah.
It's a different tool for a different job.
Yeah. Fair enough. Yeah, no, but it makes sense.
Technology-wise, and go away from the build, the ruggedness, how it has to be on set, and not only that, the rigs that are put together with some cinema cameras, but in terms of technology that's available in both systems is kind of level paring, isn't it? Getting there to a degree, but we come back to the lenses, we come back to the build.
I'll say something that I think is true, actually, is that there's 4K and then there's 4K.
Yes.
A lot of people think all 4K is equal, and all 4K is not equal.
It's not.
And that's really the difference between, let's say, the Sony A7 S Mark III and say, a Panavision DXL camera, for instance.
Yes.
Or a Red Monstro. They're totally different cameras. They do totally different things.
In different ways.
Yeah. And Hollywood would not be using those cameras if it felt it could use a cheaper option.
True.
That's true, man. It comes down to it.
They use them for a reason, basically. Yeah. They're designed for the job that they do.
Like we said previously, it's a different tool, different job. I mean, if you start going into like previous conversations we had with John, he's got a couple of bullet time rigs. Imagine throwing 72 DXLs.
That's true. Yeah, and he said as well. I said to him, "Why are you using those cameras? Because they're not full frame. It's price."
He's APS-C.
Yeah, price.
Because he's not sponsored by anyone.
Yeah.
And he owns a rental house in New York called Scheinflug in New York City as well.
Well remembered.
Scheinflug,
Well remembered.
So they deal with the the Panelux, Panavision, Arri, Sister, all the cinema cameras we know to be what we deem as proper cinema cameras. So it deals with all that stuff, and obviously all the lenses, the array we've got on the table here. So he's used to all of that. But yeah, it's a different tool, different job. Yeah. Hey folks, this is the end of part 1 of this podcast, which is episode 10 with Jeff Allen. Now, if you're enjoying what you're hearing and you want to hear the second part of this, then jump straight on over to episode 11, where part 2 continues.